So what about the trials in Australia? Maybe it grows better in Australia. Maybe it's better. When I looked on the website for Monsanto, I was very generous. This was a couple of years ago. And I looked at the very best yield they got for Roundup Ready. It was 1.055 tonne a hectare, grown in Victoria, which is the highest yielding state. That is 17% below the national average. And that's the best they could do. There is obviously a very serious yield penalty associated with post-emergent glyphosate. Don't think that you're going to do independent trials later. They're refusing to do them now because part of the contract is that Monsanto must vet any trials that are going on. You cannot grow your own independent trials. So only the positive results will be released. Invigor also refused to do independent trials. And I was on the WA Advisory Council last week when we thought we could get Esperant's independent trials done, and we thought they were going ahead, and I thought, well, that's fantastic. They refused to do them every other year, and then they withdrew from those. And the president of the WA Farmers Federation said, well, you've got to be fair to them. You know, they haven't got anything that's better than what we've already got. Well, why is it being sold as better? But their own trials come up less than non-GM hybrids, because it's a hybrid, and the same as non-GM triazine tolerant. And the little sub-notes on the trials have things like they weren't sprayed, they picked a weed-free site and the chemical wasn't applied. It's the chemical that gives you the yield drag. So if you're planning on suing them for not coming up, they're going to little notes have got there on the trials saying why they may have false positives. There's quite a few little notes, they're quite interesting. We must insist on independent trials. What about the cost? It's cheaper, we must be economically better. Monsanto won't give you the costs. Well, how can you do an economic assessment, and governments are charged with doing an economic assessment, if Monsanto won't tell you how much they're going to charge for their technology? Or how they're going to charge it, whether it's going to be an endpoint royalty. So you have Invigor at $16 a kilo, and you must buy new seed every year, or Liberty at $72 a hectare. That's $120 a hectare just for seed and chemical. Non-GM, if we replant our own, it's about 50 cents a kilo, or the most expensive seed I could find was $4.30 a kilo. Atrazine, $28 a hectare. $120 a hectare versus $29.50 a hectare. That is massive, and it gives you no radish control, no residual, so you're paying a lot more to get less. Not an economic advantage. But they have. There's one advantage probably with it that people are saying you can use glyphosate. Well, okay, make your non-GM canola resistant to glyphosate. And they say, but the chemical glufosinate ammonium is a different group. It will help with resistances. We'll register the chemical as another knockdown because we haven't got a very good knockdown alternative. So that'll be ideal. Expensive though. So when Canada adopted GM, their price dropped. We are told, promised, that there is no extra money you can get for selling non-GM, no premium. But there is certainly a price penalty as selling as GM. Because when Canada adopted GM canola around here, their consistent premium turned in to getting less for their product than we do. So there's Australia, we stayed non-GM, and during the drought when it was short, we were getting $150 a tonne more. It plummeted when the East Coast imported GM canola, because we could import it and then export it again. So farmers, if we are forced to market as GM, we'll be looking at, on average, it's around $63 a tonne that we had a decrease in money, to $150 a tonne. Or perhaps worse, Because Canada's main market is the United States, which is not GM sensitive. Our markets are GM sensitive, so you are going to have a lot of problems. And even ABARE admitted that Canada has had difficulties at disposing of canola supplies when non-GM countries do not. Income. Canadian farmers must have made a lot of profit because that's what we're promised. So you look at that. I might retry the button. They were sailing on reasonably, not that healthily, and they adopted GM. Oh! What picked them up down here was when they had a couple of really good seasons. But this year they haven't, so it's going to go down again. So here, when it got to its bottom point, 7,000 Canadian farmers marched on the streets demanding subsidies because they couldn't stay viable. What about the other countries? So you remove the countries that only grow cotton because the debate's not about cotton. You remove the countries that the government has helped the farmers with by not accepting the patent. That gets rid of Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay. It only leaves 2 countries supposedly self-sufficient with GM crops that governments recognise the patent. Now I've explained Canada. One thing that two do have in common is most of the income of farmers in these countries are on off-farm income, where Australian farmers really come on our farm to live. So remove the subsidies for Canadian farmers. That's heavily subsidised now, up over $1 billion. I think it's $1.2 billion was the last figure. And it's propped up also by state governments that prop up with an extra few subsidies in the canola growing counties. 80% of the commodity-based subsidies of the United States, which is massive subsidies, I think it's over $12 billion, is allocated to your GM crops, soy, cotton and corn. And cotton rates number 2, and it only accounts for 5% of the agricultural production. Corn is number 3, but then only 30% of the corn is GM because it's not much, they've obviously worked out it's not worth growing it. So Australia could be the first country to recognise a GM patent but not pay farmers compensation for the economic loss. They are not planning on giving us subsidies, so farmers are in serious problems in Australia. But our economic reports done by federal government are saying it's going to be an advantage. Blind Freddie can see that it's not. That's because federal government is ramming this down our throat. The reports are based on an increase in yield of 10% at least when it's not there. It ignores the additional costs when they are there. It ignores the market loss, which is pretty obvious. It ignores the need to coexist because we are both promised choice. Ignores the farmers already growing canola use chemicals and minimum tills, so it's saying, oh yeah, it'd be great, I'll save you on chemicals, save you on fuels. It's not, it's exactly the same trait. There's no difference in our farming technique that will be able to let us sow it early or anything else. That's a load of rubbish. And it uses the assumption that consumers will accept GM when it's very, very obvious they won't.